The day started like any other, but the moment I pulled into the driveway, I could feel something was off. The air had that strange tension you can't quite put your finger on, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I had just arrived, still shaking off the fatigue from the trip, and all I wanted was a quiet moment to take in the property. The tires crunched over the gravel as I slowly rolled forward, scanning the surroundings. Everything looked peaceful on the surface: manicured lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, houses lined up in perfect symmetry. But there was a subtle stiffness to it all, as if the place was holding its breath. The driveway itself was spotless, almost unnaturally so, and I could see a couple of neighbors glancing my way from behind their curtains. Not the friendly, curious kind of glance either. It was sharp, almost calculating. My truck came to a stop, the engine ticking as it cooled, and the faint hum of the summer heat filled the silence. I stepped out, stretching my legs and taking in the sight of the property. The building looked exactly how I remembered it, though there was something about the way the place seemed to be under watch that made it feel different this time. I took a few slow steps toward the front, feeling the weight of eyes on me. My boots crunched over the gravel, and I could hear faint murmurs from across the street. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect such a chilly welcome, but the atmosphere made it clear that I was already the center of attention. The air was thick, almost staged, like I had walked right into the middle of a scene that had been set up before I even got there. Before I could even take a proper look around, movement caught my eye from the corner of the lot. A couple of people, dressed neatly but walking with a kind of smug purpose, were heading directly toward me. Even from a distance, I could sense the energy. This wasn't a "welcome to the neighborhood" stroll. This was something else entirely. Their pace was steady, their posture upright, their expressions unreadable but clearly not warm. They weren't here to greet me. They were here for something else, and they wanted me to know it the second I stepped foot on this property. They reached me before I had even taken more than a few steps toward the front door. The lead figure, a man in a perfectly pressed polo shirt with an HOA badge clipped to his belt, wasted no time in sizing me up from head to toe. His companion, a woman carrying a clipboard stacked with papers, stood slightly behind him, her lips pressed into a thin, deliberate line. There was no handshake, no small talk, no trace of neighborly warmth, just an immediate, almost rehearsed tone of authority, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. Without so much as asking who I was, the man launched into his speech, rattling off points in a clipped, matter-of-fact voice. He talked about procedures and compliance requirements, making it sound like I had already done something wrong within minutes of arriving. His words were wrapped in a faux politeness, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it, the kind of tone meant to intimidate. He acted as though my presence alone was a disruption, as if I needed to justify why I was standing in my own driveway. The woman with the clipboard kept glancing between her notes and me, as though she was checking off a mental list with every sentence the man spoke. She didn't interrupt, but her silence carried a weight, reinforcing his authority without her having to say a single word. The air between us felt charged, and I could tell they weren't here for casual conversation. This was a confrontation dressed up as standard procedure, a performance meant to put me on the defensive before I even understood what was happening. Their body language told me almost as much as their words. The man stood just a little too close, his shoulders squared, feet planted like he was claiming the space between us as his own. The woman angled her clipboard toward herself, but not enough to completely hide the documents, just enough to keep me wondering what was written there. The entire exchange had the pacing of something practiced, as though this wasn't the first time they had approached someone like this, and they were confident it wouldn't be the last. It was clear they had arrived with a plan, one they expected to execute without resistance. Every sentence seemed designed to establish dominance from the outset, to make me feel like I had already stepped out of line before I'd even set foot inside the building. The man's tone shifted subtly as he began to reference specific regulations and recent changes to community guidelines, speaking with the kind of confidence that comes from assuming the other person won't question what's being said. He didn't produce any actual documents, but he spoke as though the rules were carved in stone, delivered from some unquestionable authority. Every phrase was sprinkled with official-sounding jargon, phrases like mandatory compliance, penalty schedule, and pre-existing infractions, all designed to make it sound like the matter was already settled before I could respond. The woman with the clipboard finally chimed in, her voice measured and cool, reading off what she claimed were recorded violations. She listed them with an air of inevitability, as though each point was indisputable fact. The way she read them made it clear she expected me to accept them without hesitation. She didn't offer proof, photographs, or dates, just the statements themselves, as if the sheer act of saying them out loud was enough to make them real. The tactic was obvious: overwhelm with technical language, press for quick acknowledgement, and avoid leaving enough room for questions. I could tell they were working in tandem, their rhythm practiced. The man would assert a supposed rule, and the woman would follow with an example of how I had already broken it. It was a 1-2 punch meant to corner me into compliance before I had time to think. There was a deliberate pressure in their pacing, a steady push forward that made it feel like each statement was building toward an inevitable demand. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that their goal wasn't to inform, but to intimidate. The violations they claimed seemed oddly vague, almost conveniently so. Phrases like improper exterior compliance or non-approved usage floated in the air without a single clear explanation attached. It wasn't about what was true. It was about what they could convince me was true. The man kept leaning in slightly with each point, as though closing the distance would make his claims more believable. The woman avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on her papers, reinforcing the idea that their authority came from something written down somewhere I couldn't see. It was the classic bluff: act as though the rules are unshakable, present them with unwavering confidence, and count on the other person not realizing they're being cornered until it's too late. I let them speak without interruption, not because I believed a word of it, but because I wanted to watch them dig themselves deeper. All the while, I stood there with a calm that seemed to make them uneasy. They thought they were setting the stage, building up their authority, but I already knew something they didn't. This property wasn't just another stop for me. It was part of my portfolio, one of several holdings in the area. And nestled among those holdings was a particularly interesting asset: the very building where their HOA office was located. That single fact shifted the entire balance of power, though they were blissfully unaware. Every condescending phrase they threw my way, every fabricated violation they rattled off, only made the irony sharper. I had seen plenty of HOA boards try to flex before, but this was different. These people weren't just overstepping. They were standing on ground I owned, making demands as if I were the one dependent on them. The man kept talking, probably assuming my silence meant I was intimidated. He had no idea that I'd been in real estate long enough to recognize a bluff the moment I saw one. My investments weren't just properties. They were leverage, and in situations like this, Leverage was everything. The woman continued flipping through her clipboard, likely reading from a pre-prepared script, and I wondered if she had ever once questioned who actually signed the checks that kept their operations running. I thought about the lease agreement I had in my files, the one with their HOA's name printed clearly across the top. I thought about the monthly rent payments that passed through my management office without fail, and how easy it would be to make their lives complicated if I decided to. They operated under the assumption that they were untouchable within their jurisdiction, that they could pull this act on anyone who happened to cross into their neatly controlled territory. What they didn't realize was that their territory existed because people like me allowed it to. I kept my posture relaxed, letting them finish their carefully rehearsed lines. Every second they spent posturing was another second closer to the moment when their confidence would falter. They believed they were dealing with just another homeowner under their thumb, but the reality was that I was the one holding the strings, and they were standing there unknowingly performing on my stage. The shift began the moment I decided to speak. I didn't raise my voice or match their confrontational tone. Instead, I let my words carry the weight of quiet certainty. I started by asking a few pointed questions, ones they clearly weren't expecting. Simple things, like the specific clause number for the guideline changes they'd mentioned or the date those alleged violations were documented. The man hesitated for a split second, a tiny crack in his confident facade, before trying to mask it with more vague language. The woman glanced up from her clipboard, her expression flickering for just an instant before she forced it back into neutral. I let the questions hang in the air, not filling the silence, forcing them to respond. Then, almost casually, I mentioned the address of their HOA office. The man froze mid-sentence, clearly caught off guard, and the woman's pen stopped moving. I could see the calculations beginning in their minds, trying to figure out how I even knew that detail. That's when I told them exactly why I knew it, because I owned the building. Not metaphorically, not in some distant corporate way, but literally. Their desks, their chairs, the roof over their heads, all of it sat on my deed. The color drained from the man's face, just slightly, though he tried to recover. The woman's grip on the clipboard tightened. Neither of them said anything right away, and that silence was louder than any argument they could have made. I didn't have to explain what that meant in practical terms. They knew. Their entire authority here relied on their ability to intimidate and enforce rules, but their operations still depended on a lease agreement they couldn't afford to jeopardize. I could feel the dynamic in the air flipping. Every word I spoke from that point wasn't defensive. It was deliberate, measured, and layered with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you hold the stronger position. I reminded them, in a tone that was more matter-of-fact than threatening, that I was fully aware of their lease terms. I didn't need to raise my voice or push for dramatic effect. The simple truth was enough to change the temperature of the conversation entirely. Their earlier certainty was gone, replaced by the quiet, uneasy awareness that they had misjudged the situation from the very first moment we spoke. The look on their faces was all the confirmation I needed. The man's confident stance had shifted. His shoulders weren't squared anymore, and he seemed to be standing just a fraction farther back than before. The woman, who had been so precise and brisk with her notes earlier, now held her clipboard closer to her chest, as if it could shield her from the reality that had just landed in the space between us. Neither of them was making eye contact the way they had at the beginning. The sharp, evaluating stares had been replaced by quick, uncertain glances. It was subtle, but the energy in the air had completely changed. Where there had been an attempt to dominate the conversation, there was now hesitation. Every second of silence seemed to stretch longer, and I could almost see the gears turning in their heads as they tried to rethink their approach without admitting they had been wrong. The authority they had walked up with was gone, replaced by a quiet awkwardness they didn't quite know how to navigate. The man finally spoke again, but his voice lacked the clipped authority from before. He stumbled slightly over his words, trying to reframe the conversation as something more collaborative rather than confrontational. It was the verbal equivalent of stepping back from a fight without actually saying you were retreating. The woman nodded along, but her earlier air of control had been replaced with something more cautious, as though every word she might say now had to be weighed carefully. I didn't press them or gloat, but I could see the unease settling in. They knew exactly what my position meant, and they knew there was no way to spin this encounter in their favor without risking more than they could afford. The bold, rehearsed performance they had started with had unraveled, leaving only the reality of the situation, one where they weren't the ones in control. The neighbors who had been peeking from their windows earlier were still watching, but now their interest seemed to have shifted. They could sense that something had shifted in the interaction, even if they didn't know the details. What had started as a staged display of HOA authority had turned into a quiet, uncomfortable standstill, with the balance of power sitting firmly where neither of them had expected it to be.